Okay, we might get started then. Thank you everybody so much for joining us for another webinar of the Tasmanian Parkinson's Project. I've just got the website up there. If you haven't yet joined, we'd love you to join us. Hopefully this will move on. Yes, just going to start by doing an acknowledgement of country. So we acknowledge the Palawa Pakana of Lutruwina, the traditional owners of the land on which we live and work here in Tasmania, and also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which you all join from today. We pay respects to elders past and present as the knowledge holders and sharers. We honour their strong culture and knowledges as vital to the self-determination, well-being and resilience of their communities. And we stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language and history. So for those of you that haven't met me before, I'm Michelle Calasire. I'm a physiotherapist, an academic at the University of Tasmania, living with Parkinson's disease now for 3.5 years. Jane Alty is a neurologist also here at the University of Tasmania, but unfortunately she can't join us today. She's actually in the UK. But we're extremely lucky to have Associate Professor Fiona Lithander here today, and I'll introduce her a little bit after just giving you a short introduction and update on the Tasmanian Parkinson's Project. So excitingly to date, we have 3,701 people who have joined. We are aiming for 5,000 people, so please tell friends, family, anyone who you think might be interested in learning more about Parkinson's or participating in our research. We are looking for anyone over the age of 18, whether you have Parkinson's or not. So please tell your friends and family to join as well. Some of you might have done the Parkinson's MOOC that we launched earlier this year, and we thank you for doing that and hope that you really enjoyed it. And just to let you know that we will be relaunching it later this year, probably in October. If you missed any of our webinars, you can go onto the website and there's the Education and Webinars tab and catch up of any of the webinars that you might have missed. We had a great one last time on MIME for Parkinson's. And then just very quickly to give you an update on the different research projects that we've been running. You will have received an invitation to participate in TasTest. So this is a really short test that you can do at home on your computer, where it looks at hand movements, your voice and some other questions. So we really encourage you to participate in that. And we've got some other really exciting studies coming up as well. One has been designed with people living with Parkinson's to look at people's experience with healthcare and looking at gaps with the purpose of trying to improve healthcare, particularly in Australia. The other survey that's coming up is to look at people's perspectives of monitoring walking and thinking over time, with the idea of intervening early before problems exist. For both of these studies, they'll come out in the next couple of months, and you will have the chance to win a couple of $150 gift vouchers for participating. So without further ado, I'd really like to welcome Associate Professor Fiona Lithander. She's a dietitian who has a strong interest in Parkinson's and diet, and she's from New Zealand, but apparently did her study here in Australia. So Fiona, I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Michelle. Can I just check that you can see my slides and they're full screen and you can hear me okay?
Perfect.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'd like to thank you, Michelle and the wider team in Tasmania for the invitation to come and speak with you today. It's an absolute privilege, so thank you. I'm actually from Ireland. You can probably tell from this accent. Originally from Ireland, but you're absolutely right. I'm based in New Zealand, based at the University of Auckland at a research institute called the Liggins Institute. So I'm a nutrition scientist, and I'm also a dietitian. And as Michelle mentioned, I did my dietetics training at the University of Wollongong. So I've lived in Australia for a time. I'm familiar with the health service in Australia, the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating and dietary advice across Australia. So I feel I have a real affinity with Australia for that reason. So very well versed in the context there. So as I mentioned, I'm originally from Ireland. I did my PhD in nutrition physiology, and that was at the University of Cambridge in the UK. Lived for a bit in Australia, and I was lucky enough to come to Tasmania just earlier this year. I was there in February. And I was there for the launch of the MOOC, and it was, again, a real privilege not only to contribute towards the MOOC, but to be there for the launch. So thank you for hosting me. So what I'd like to talk about today is food for thought and how diet can support people with Parkinson's. So the plan for today is what I'd like to do first is talk about how Parkinson's can affect nutritional health or nutritional status. And then we're going to talk a bit about the gut microbiome, because there's quite a lot of new evidence around the gut microbiome in Parkinson's and whether diet can actually have an impact on it. Then I'm going to move along to what dietary strategies, in particular dietary patterns. We've heard of, the Mediterranean diet, ketogenic diets, etc. And what dietary strategies can be used to help manage symptoms in Parkinson's. Really going to highlight the evidence where there is evidence for that. And then I'm going to finish off with some practical dietary strategies, and I'm going to ask you what maybe one change might you make today after hearing this talk. So we'll finish off with practical dietary strategies, and I'm really happy to take questions after that. So I'm really pleased that in the last 25 years, there's been a huge increase in the number of research studies that have been published in the area of nutrition and Parkinson's. I think certainly over the last couple of years, there's been real change in approach in terms of there's been much greater attention, not only among people with Parkinson's, caregivers, healthcare professionals and beyond, academics, to the non-pharmacological approaches such as exercise and diet. And I think over the last 10 years, there's been a huge increase in really well-run research studies and trials in exercise. And we now have a really nice evidence base to show that different forms of exercise and durations and intensities can really be used to help people with Parkinson's manage some symptoms. And I think nutrition, in the area of nutrition science, that's where we're trying to get to. We haven't got there yet, but it's great that the lens is very much focused on exercise and nutrition, increasingly to provide, I guess, some things that people can have control over to a lesser or greater degree themselves. And it's interesting because people often say, well, does diet matter? I don't see much research out there. Or does diet matter because, there's a real mix of research out there? And the answer is yes, diet does matter. And we have quite a bit of research. It's on the increase, as you can see from this slide, but we need a lot more research in this area. And isn't it fantastic that finally we're moving in this direction, which is excellent. So can your Parkinson's affect your nutritional health? And the answer is yes. And I just want to talk through a few ways where it can affect your nutritional health. And when I say nutritional health, I mean nutritional status, which is a term you might have come across, or really the body's ability to get the nutrients it needs and to be able to digest and absorb and utilize the nutrients that it needs. And we get those nutrients, as we know, from the food and drink that we consume. So Parkinson's can affect nutritional health. And I guess this sort of also sings to the importance of a dietitian providing support to people with Parkinson's, because many symptoms can adversely affect nutritional status or nutritional health. So I'm just going to walk through these. I'll start on the left-hand side, blue. They're the gastrointestinal issues. So there are quite a few studies now to show that smell and taste are adversely affected in Parkinson's. And there are studies to show that people who have issues with smell and taste tend to eat less. If we move down the gastrointestinal tract, swallowing issues can be an issue. And again, that can lead to eating less. And when I say eating less, of course, that means eating less volume of foods or maybe types of foods, and therefore restricting intake of specific nutrients. Moving further down the gastrointestinal tract, so still staying with the blue bit, we see a number of gastrointestinal issues that can happen. So issues with gut motility, issues with digestion, so the function of the stomach. And in fact, that's an area we're doing quite a bit of research, is looking at emptying of food from the stomach. So when food is eaten, and there's quite a bit of data to show that when a meal is eaten, it tends to stay in the stomach of somebody with Parkinson's a bit longer than somebody without Parkinson's. We're really trying to understand that, because that can cause some issues itself. And then moving further down the gastrointestinal tract, constipation is something that comes up time and time again. It's reported by lots of people with Parkinson's. And in fact, in the last 4 weeks, we've been doing a number of stakeholder engagement groups across wider Auckland here in New Zealand, and engaging with people with Parkinson's, caregivers, dieticians, nurses, etc. And time again, these gastrointestinal issues, including constipation, comes up quite a bit. And I've got some tips around that coming up in a few slides. Looking at the two that are in black font, so worsening dexterity, so tremor and involuntary movement, ability to hold cutlery, for instance, or crockery, again, can decrease people's intake, dietary intake. Bone health can be an issue in Parkinson's, where people with Parkinson's tend to be at increased risk of osteoporosis, an increased risk of falls. Muscle health can be compromised, so less strength and muscle mass. And then cognitive effects. So again, we see in some of the research that apathy and various other cognitive effects really can lead to people eating a little bit less, therefore having access to or taking on fewer nutrients that are needed. And of course, much of this can lead to weight loss, which I'll get on to later on. So really just highlighting that Parkinson's can, for all sorts of reasons, affect nutritional health or nutritional status. And again, the importance of really a dietitian being part of a multidisciplinary team and providing support to people with Parkinson's for these sorts of reasons. I'm going to move on to the gut microbiome, because again, it's really only in the last number of years that we have learned as researchers and scientists, and as a more broad community, that there is a whole host of microorganisms that live in the digestive tract. They've been there all along. It's really only the fact that we've got fancy new laboratory equipment that we can actually use to measure them and look at the composition and function of them. And we do that by taking fecal samples or poo samples, collecting those from individuals, and measuring the bacteria and the virus that live in the digestive tract. And those microorganisms, those bugs that live in the gut that make up the gut microbiome, they play a really important role in health. They act as gatekeepers at the gut wall. So they work really closely with different cells of the immune system, really to keep out harmful substances. So keep them out, as in keep them within the gastrointestinal tract so that they're excreted and don't get absorbed into the body. So they work in a complex way to maintain overall health. So the gut microbiome, as I say, all it is the bugs that live in our gut. But it does seem to be altered in Parkinson's. And this one study was published by some colleagues in the UK just a few years ago, and they looked at all of the data sets up until that point where from people with Parkinson's, where the gut microbiome was presented. And essentially, there seems to be more of the bad bacteria and fewer of the good bacteria in the gut microbiome in people with Parkinson's. And that may lead to inflammation, which then could be linked back to those gastrointestinal symptoms that earlier on the first or second slide in blue, I had said that there are a number of gastrointestinal symptoms that people with Parkinson's face, and it may be due to an adverse change in the microbiome, so in the composition and function of the bugs that live in the gut. one hypothesis anyhow. And there's all sorts of reasons and all sorts of influences on our gut microbiome composition and function. So there's some that we can change, some that we cannot change. So for instance, things like physical activity, diet, they're modifiable things, we can change those. They can impact the microbiome, the gut microbiome. There's other things that we cannot change: our age, our gender, or our genetics, for instance. And there's other factors that can influence the gut microbiome composition and function. But there was one study published just last year to show that there is a relationship between what we eat and the gut microbiome in Parkinson's. So this particular study recruited 85 people with Parkinson's, and they used a very well-validated assessment tool to measure diet. So lots of studies and trials that measure diet usually ask people to fill out questionnaires, and some of the questionnaires are better than others. But in this particular study, there was a really useful, really important, good questionnaire or good tool was used to measure dietary intake in this group of 85 people with Parkinson's. And what they showed was that a healthier diet, and I'll get on in a few minutes to really characterize what a healthier diet is. A healthier diet was associated with a greater abundance of those anti-inflammatory bacteria. So remember, we're talking about the bugs in the gut. Some are pro-inflammatory, some are anti-inflammatory. So those people with Parkinson's who consumed a healthier diet had greater abundance of bacteria which are anti-inflammatory, while a decreased abundance of the pro-inflammatory bacteria in the gut of people with Parkinson's. So this healthy, diverse diet may support a healthy, good gut microbiome. So just coming back, and I've highlighted in green this healthy, diverse diet, because I'm going to, towards the end of the talk, really just highlight how we can really ensure that we get a healthy, diverse diet. But again, that diversity in food that we consume may lead to a much healthier gut microbiome in Parkinson's. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the current research around diet and whether it can be used to manage symptoms. And there's lots out there. And when we talk about diet, there's a few different things we can talk about. We can talk about supplements, so things that we can take that supplement our diet. We can talk about foods, so different individual foods might have an effect on different health outcomes. But interestingly, more recently, the nutrition science, or the field of nutrition science, kind of has certainly moved away from the reductionist approach of studying individual nutrients. We're kind of moving away from studying individual foods. And the reason for that is we tend not to sit down and eat individual nutrients. It's 1 o'clock where you are, and you probably, hopefully, have had some lunch. Most of the time when we eat a meal like our lunch, you probably didn't sit down and eat an individual nutrient. You probably had a mixture of nutrients, probably had a mixture of foods, and you probably had a pattern of food. So the science of nutrition has moved away from this reductionist approach of looking at the intake and the effect of individual nutrients and even individual foods on health. For that very reason, we tend not to eat individual nutrients and foods. We eat patterns of foods. I'd like to just mention at this point as well is that a lot of the data that has looked at the relationship between nutrition or diet and intake of different things and outcomes in Parkinson's comes from observational data. And we know that observational studies are really important. We know that, and when I say an observational study, this may be where a group of people with Parkinson's are recruited. They fill out a questionnaire, which they report what they've been eating and drinking, usually sort of habitually, or what they ate and drank in the last 24 hours, something like that. And then they would be asked to record some symptoms or a particular health outcome. And then researchers look at an association or a relationship between a particular nutrient or food and a particular symptom, for instance. That's their observational studies. and observational studies are looking at relationships between X and Y. They're looking at a correlation between X and Y, but they're not cause and effect. And I think it's just, I just want to highlight that, because much of the data out there is observational, and I'll highlight where it is and where it isn't. And observational studies are really important because they raise a hypothesis, and then those of us who run intervention trials, who run these sort of high quality randomized control trials, can then test that hypothesis. So there is an important place for observational studies, but I'll highlight as I go, when I talk about the research, which data come from observational studies and which actually come from trials, and it's from trials where we get that cause and effect. All right, so move on to the first one on my list, which is probiotics and symbiotics. So probiotics are essentially whether it's capsules or powders or drinks or yogurts or what might be, tend to carry live microorganisms, some bacteria in them. And there's lots and lots of probiotics for sale. If you go into your local supermarket, you'll see lots of, even in the dairy aisle, you'll see lots of yogurts and what have you, containing all sorts of ranges of probiotics. So probiotics contain the bugs, the bacteria. I just want to define these three things. So prebiotics tend to be substrates that are found in some foods like onion and garlic and other many foods that we eat as part of our usual intake. And I know that you probably eat in Australia substrates that the bacteria in the gut, or the microorganisms, the bugs in the gut, actually they use that those prebiotic substrates as a food. So probiotics are the bugs themselves. Prebiotics are the kind of the foods that feed the bugs. And then symbiotics are a combination of pre and probiotics. Oh, I noticed a typo on my slide. So symbiotics are a combination of pro and prebiotics. So hopefully that just explains the ins and outs. So I really want to highlight the data around probiotics and symbiotics, simply because there's quite a lot of it available at the moment. So the trials, of which there are many in people with Parkinson's, that have tested whether probiotics are effective, quite a few trials, maybe about a dozen trials now. I just want to point to a couple of nuances we need to be careful about. The bacterial species tested from one trial to the next are very different. So some of them have used some bacterial species, some of them have used others. The dose of probiotic within whether it's a drink or a capsule or a powder or a yogurt, the dose, some probiotic doses are quite large, some are quite small. And as I mentioned, there's different capsules and powders and drinks, etc., are used. And then in the trials where you give a group of people with Parkinson's the probiotic, and then you give you randomize group of people to a probiotic, for instance, for a 12-week period, and they consume it every day for 12 weeks. And then you randomize the other part of the group are randomized in a random fashion to a control, which is a comparator. The comparators that are used in the different trials are quite different. So whilst probiotics and symbiotics in particular are showing promise for constipation in Parkinson's, I just want to highlight that there's quite a bit of heterogeneity between the trials. And some of the probiotics may actually interact with some of the medication that many of you may be taking. And I think it's really important that if you consider taking some of these supplements, that you discuss it with your movement disorder specialist. There was what we call a meta-analysis where somebody took all of the trials, crunched the numbers, published in early 2023, and they concluded by saying we also need trials of longer duration. So as I say, probiotics, symbiotics, that whole area is showing some promise for constipation, but nuanced by the fact that may interact with Parkinson's medication, which is really important, and there's considerable differences from one trial to the next, so it's very difficult to compare them all. So that's where the evidence is around probiotics, symbiotics. There's actually no randomized control trials of prebiotics by themselves. So I'm going to move on to the Mediterranean diet, and as you can see from the picture, the Mediterranean diet is is characterized by a range of foods. So lots of fruit and vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds. You can see legumes. So you can see lentils, chickpeas, oily fish. You can see a piece of salmon in the center. So that's what characterizes the Mediterranean diet. I always think we don't need to live in the Mediterranean to eat a Mediterranean diet, and we can certainly adopt a Mediterranean diet or adapt a Mediterranean diet according to our cultures. So we can, we don't have to have the fruit and vegetables exactly that are in the photo. You can consume the fruit and vegetables that are more appropriate for your culture. So we don't need to live in the Mediterranean to eat this way. And I know that many of the foods, and I forgot to mention olive oil, of course, is a key component of the Mediterranean diet. And I know that many of these foods are available, or all of these foods are available in Australia. So the mechanism of action for the Mediterranean diet, so rich in fruit, vegetables, and whole grains, and those foods tend to have properties or components that are anti-inflammatory, and also anti-inflammatory things like polyphenols, for instance, that you can find in some fruits. Oily fish, you've got salmon there, mackerel is another example, tend to contain omega-3 fatty acids. You'll be familiar with that term, and evidence shows that they tend to be neuroprotective. So what is the data with respect to Parkinson's, Mediterranean diet and Parkinson's? Let's put the two together. So there certainly are some observational studies. And remember, I mentioned the observational studies. So there are studies that show that people with Parkinson's who consume the Mediterranean diet, well, interestingly, Mediterranean diet reduces the risk of developing Parkinson's. But in terms of trials, where people with Parkinson's have been recruited and randomized either to follow the Mediterranean diet or to follow sort of usual dietary intake, there's only 2 trials and 1 pilot study published globally. And those trials have looked at the effect of the Mediterranean diet on cognition and saw some interesting things with respect to, interesting improvements with respect to executive function, language. And that was from a Mediterranean diet trial that was published in Iran a couple of years ago. And then colleagues in Florida have done a Mediterranean diet trial looking at gastrointestinal health outcomes. So whilst it shows promise, we only have 2 trials and 1 study, but bear in mind that the Mediterranean diet is, it does cover all the food groups. We'll talk about the food groups towards the end of the talk. Rich in whole grains, rich in fruit and vegetables. So a dietary approach that is very similar to the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. So it is an approach with promise. Let's have a look at the other dietary pattern that I mentioned, and that's the ketogenic diet. So just as a reminder, that's a dietary pattern where people are advised to eat high-fat, low-carbohydrate foods. And the mechanism is such that the neurons that are affected in Parkinson's use ketone bodies, which are a substrate of this high-fat, low-carbohydrate approach, and use those as an energy source instead of glucose. And there's only been 4 trials in Parkinson's using the ketogenic diet, and they're really small feasibility, safety, efficacy trials, and they looked at motor symptoms and non-motor symptoms such as anxiety and voice. But we need to exercise some caution because long-term use of the ketogenic diet, we know, number 1, that there are adverse changes in non-Parkinson's population to the gut microbiome in response to the ketogenic diet. And we already know that people with Parkinson's do have a change in the gut microbiome. We know that in some of these trials of ketogenic diet, we see weight loss, and that increases the risk of malnutrition. And thirdly, in general, ketogenic diets tend to be associated with micronutrient deficiencies. And people with Parkinson's do have some deficiencies in some B vitamins, some micronutrients. So following a dietary pattern that actually we see maybe an increase in micronutrient deficiencies is something to be cautious about. And because it's high in fat, it's high in saturated fat, which can increase the risk of cardiovascular diseases. And we know that people with Parkinson's aren't immune to other things, whether it's cardiovascular disease, diabetes, etc. So just a few points of note there. Interestingly, there's some colleagues based in Canada, and they're doing a trial which is Mediterranean diet and keto diet combined. This is super hot off the press because the results, so interestingly, so in Parkinson's, took a group of people with Parkinson's and half on a Mediterranean diet combined with a keto diet and half to a more controlled diet. And they're really looking at the effect on gut inflammation and the gut barrier that I mentioned earlier. There's no results available yet, and they have unpublished results available online, and you'll see that the reference there, and their first set of I say unpublished, they're online, but they haven't been peer reviewed. They say that this approach is safe, but adherence, so people with Parkinson's found that adhering to this kind of dietary approach was really difficult. We can talk more about that. So just to begin to wrap things up with some helpful strategies based on what we've spoken about. So what can you do today? So I'm going to talk about three things: dietary variety and diversity, and we know that's important for the gut microbiome, but for in general in Parkinson's, because there is not one particular diet. There's no diet for Parkinson's just yet, because we're still doing the research and beginning to develop consensus around what's important. Secondly, I'm going to talk about dietary fiber for constipation and that healthy gut microbiome, because we know constipation is an issue. And then coming back to healthy body weight, which I mentioned I'd come back to. So first thing, so you might be familiar with the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. This is something that was produced in Australia many years ago, and you probably may have seen it in your GP waiting room and various other places. And again, if you Google Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, there's also some useful resources. But this would be my go-to if I were you with respect to dietary variety and diversity, because what you can see on the top, so each of these triangles are food groups. And eating foods from these various food groups on a daily basis will really ensure that you get all the nutrients that you need, the protein, the fat, the carbohydrate, and then all the micronutrients, which are the vitamins and minerals. So for instance, this one here in orange is the grain cereal foods, mostly whole grain, high fiber varieties. And you might come away today and say, rolled oats. Okay, so I'm gonna have rolled oats. I'm gonna make a change. I won't have them every day for breakfast, but twice a week I'm gonna have rolled oats, and that will really help me increase my fiber intake. Or I might swap my white rice for brown rice, or I might swap my white bread for brown bread, for instance. So we know that grainy foods not only contain quite a bit of fiber, but also contain a number of those B vitamins that we spoke about. Fruit and veg over here on the right-hand side. And people say to me, oh, don't make me eat bananas. I hate bananas. Don't make me eat, I don't know what it might be, carrots. I really dislike. That's fine. We all have individual likes and dislikes, and that doesn't matter in the slightest. But there's plenty of options within these categories, and there may be other options that are available to you within your culture. So again, ensuring that fruit and veg are a regular feature day in, day out. I always say that you don't need to eat the fresh fruit and veg. Certainly here in New Zealand, it's very expensive. So whether your fruit and veg is tinned or frozen or comes in a jar, what have you, dried is absolutely fine. Then we have the milk yogurt and alternatives. And then on this side, we have the protein containing foods, whether it's meat and poultry and fish and plant and animal sources of protein. So in terms of variety and diversity, just thinking to yourself, each day, am I sort of getting foods from these different food groups? The second thing was dietary fiber. So I've got the exact same Australian Guide to Healthy Eating up, because I've just highlighted, circling it, that many of these foods actually contain a significant amount of dietary fiber. So just thinking of those swaps I mentioned within the grain category, you could maybe make some swaps or some changes in terms of fruit or veg. You might say to yourself, well, okay, so every morning I'm going to put some frozen berries or some tinned apricots on my rolled oats, for instance. So just considering that increasing even by one portion, these foods from these categories will absolutely increase your dietary fiber intake day in, day out. I should say that down in the blue bit here, there's also protein containing foods, fiber containing foods in this protein category. So nuts, seeds, legumes and beans, they all contain fiber as well. So lots of options for even one change to increase fiber intake to help with constipation. And then the last strategy is maintaining a healthy weight. So if you have lost weight, and many people with Parkinson's do lose weight, first of all, check with your GP in case it's something unrelated to your Parkinson's and something that needs to be checked out. So that would be my first note of caution. And also note that being underweight or overweight can affect your health. So just a few reasons for maybe why people with Parkinson's are losing weight and what you can do. And I've got a good resource in the bottom right corner here. Parkinson's UK has lots of useful information on its website. So possible causes, it may be some of the medications that, impact negatively on your appetite, or that cause daytime sleepiness, therefore you've less opportunity to eat and therefore weight is lost. I mentioned before difficulties swallowing, but difficulties chewing is another reason why people lose weight, because they may not be able to chew food as well and therefore restrict their types of food to reduce their intake of foods that they have difficulty chewing. Increased movement caused by tremors and dyskinesia. So increased tremors and dyskinesia can really increase the amount of calories you burn. Therefore, you need some more calories consumed to actually account for that. And then practical things such as food shopping, preparation, keeping your food hot while you're eating. Those sorts of things are really key, can be really key issues for people. So in terms of top tips, you can see them on the right-hand side. And I can give you more examples of these sorts of actual practical examples if you'd like me to just ask in the question and answer section. And as I say, before you leave the seminar today, just think to yourself, what one change might I make? And I give you a few suggestions, but maybe think to yourself, what one change can I make today that might help things a little bit? So I'm going to say thank you for the kind invitation and very happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona. That was absolutely fantastic. And I can see that we've had over 370 people online, which is just fantastic. And we've got a couple of questions. And I'm thinking already, what am I going to change? Maybe some more lentils or chickpeas in my diet. I'd just really like to ask if you can recommend any sites that have nice, simple, easy recipes that are meeting the Mediterranean diet or the Australian, just nice, simple recipes for people.
Yeah, really good question. So I'm going to come back to the thing you mentioned about lentils and chickpeas, and then I'll come back to the recipes. A really good tip for those is if you're making a bolognese or a curry or something, you can pop some tinned lentils in and you won't even notice. Drain them off, give them a good rinse in the colander. But it's a good way of increasing the amount of protein in your diet, increasing the amount of fiber, and getting those in, a bolognese or a curry or something. You will barely notice that they're in there. So really good suggestion. And chickpeas, things like hummus are really good chickpea options. So just another tip. In terms of recipes, do I know a good website? Let me come back to you on that, because I think there's probably a variety out there, but I'd like to just recommend a useful one. So I can send that to you. I'll have a good dig around and send that across to you, and you can make it available to people.
We can put it on the website.
Yeah,
brilliant.
Perfect.
All right, I might hand over to Claire, who's going to pose a few questions. And if people can put in the Q&A any questions, but try and keep them relevant to diet and nutrition if possible, because we haven't got Jane, our neurologist, with us today.
Sure. One of the questions is around what a vegan diet would look like in this space, and also about the sugar levels in dried fruit. Would you like to comment on those two things?
Yeah, for sure. So can I share my screen again, Claire? Would that be helpful?
Absolutely. Yep, that's fine.
Just if I put up the slide that I showed, which is the let's have a see. Can you see that again?
Yep.
Great. So just in terms of a vegan diet, so there are many foods in this particular Australian Guide to Healthy Eating that are vegan foods. And in terms of the dairy side of things, there's lots of alternatives. So alternatives to milk, yogurt, and cheese, which are soy-based, rice-based, etc. I think the word of caution around that is to ensure that you get the calcium fortified options. And when you go to the supermarket, there'll be a range of these sorts of dairy alternatives, but there'll be calcium fortified options. So go for those to ensure that calcium intake is adequate, because we know that people with Parkinson's are at increased risk of osteoporosis, and I mentioned that at the start. And then if we have a look at the protein category, again, there's lots of plant-based options for protein. So you can see there we've got tofu, nuts, seeds, legumes, beans, lots of plant-based options. I would, however, suggest that you do see a dietitian, because there are some micronutrients that people who follow a vegan diet just need to be aware of, that they don't become deficient in. So just having the support of a dietitian, maybe speak to your movement disorder doctor or your GP and ask for the support of a dietitian to ensure that those micronutrients, those vitamins, minerals aren't missed, just to ensure that you get an adequate amount of those. But in principle, yes, absolutely fine to follow that approach. Just also need to keep an eye on weight as well, to make sure that the amount of calories or the amount of energy that's consumed is adequate, because weight loss is often a thing in Parkinson's, and just ensuring that following a vegan approach that weight is maintained.
And there's another question here just about alcohol and Parkinson's.
So I would suggest just following the national guidelines that are available in Australia around alcohol intake. I don't know those off the tip of my tongue in terms of the number of units per week and what have you, but they would be the ones that you would follow.
Sure. And there's a question here. Do you know whether changes in gut bacteria happen before the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, or if these are a result of the disease itself?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. I'm just having a wee look through my notes here, because it's a really interesting point. There's some suggestion. So the whole area of gut bacteria, it's really only become quite popular in the last number of years, because it's only in the last number of years that we've got laboratory equipment to allow us to analyze, in this case, stool or fecal poo samples to measure the gut bacteria. So there is a sort of a theory that some people with Parkinson's, they sort of, you might have heard of brain first or body first. And it's sort of brain first Parkinson's is, in some people, maybe the disease starts in the brain, and in particular in those neurons that are responsible for, in the areas that are responsible for movement. And those individuals may first notice, tremor or dyskinesia or stiffness, for instance. And then there's the sort of body first Parkinson's. So, and that's where the Parkinson's may begin in the gastrointestinal tract, or there may be, remember I mentioned when I was talking about the microbiome, and I said some harmful substances might get through the gut barrier into the system, into the vagus nerve, and that's the nerve that connects the gut to the brain, and they might travel up to the brain. So we don't really know. It's an area of hot research. It's an area of ongoing research, but we don't really know in some people which actually came first. And yeah, it's an area of ongoing research, which is really interesting, isn't it? And I think I'm really excited to continue to see how that develops.
Another question. What are your views of the place of the keto diet and intermittent fasting?
Yeah, really, really good question. So I mentioned the ketogenic diet, and I highlighted that there's very few trials. I think I said there's only 4, and I'm not even sure that they're all even controlled trials. Very small, safe, for looking at safety and efficacy and feasibility. So data around ketogenic diets are in Parkinson's is predominantly from preclinical research, so animal model research. And I think there is some promise to the approach, but we're quite far away from having enough evidence to recommend ketogenic diets, I think, for people with Parkinson's just yet. And I think there are a number of sort of safety concerns. And I mentioned colleagues who are based in Canada, they're based in UBC, and they would suggest that these safety concerns are things we really need to take into consideration. So for instance, ketogenic diets often are not have poor dietary quality and are associated with some deficiencies in micronutrients. And we know that people with Parkinson's do have deficiencies in some of the B vitamins already. We don't know why. So then following a dietary pattern that might even exacerbate or contribute to those deficiencies in those vitamins is probably not a safe approach, or is not a safe approach. Secondly, another sort of safety concern is some ketogenic diets, because they're so high in fat and saturated fat, which is the bad fat, which increases our blood cholesterol, can then increase risk of cardiovascular disease. And people with Parkinson's aren't immune to cardiovascular disease, other metabolic, other conditions. So we just need to ensure that we're maintaining a good approach for heart health, for cardiovascular health, for those sorts of, so following a diet that may increase risk of another chronic condition is, again, probably not a good approach. And in some of the trials I referred to, the ketogenic trials, we see weight loss, and people with Parkinson's often lose weight anyhow, and again, following a dietary pattern that is restrictive in terms of the foods you can eat, that may contribute towards weight loss, when weight loss can already be an issue, is another concern. And then I mentioned that in some non-Parkinson's populations, we see adverse changes to the gut microbiome. We see that in Parkinson's as well. So we don't want a dietary pattern that might contribute to further adverse changes in the gut microbiome. So I think we need to just wait to see what else comes out, but it's maybe in the context of personalized nutrition, where somebody is under the care of a ketogenic dietitian, and it's done in a very sort of controlled way. But I think I would be a little cautious about ketogenic diets for those reasons. Just at the moment, I think we need more data. And then you asked about intermittent fasting. So there's one trial underway in Parkinson's with respect to intermittent fasting. So I had a good look. So there was a review article that was published in 2023, and they looked at people with a variety of neurodegenerative diseases, including Parkinson's. And the conclusion of that review, those authors said more trials are needed. So in Luxembourg at the moment, there's a trial ongoing in Parkinson's. It's called the Exobiome trial, and they're looking at the effects of fasting in particular on the microbiome. So again, the microbiome is coming up time and time again. So they're looking at, so they're randomizing people with Parkinson's to fasting for a period and having restricted intake versus a control group, and collecting fecal samples and looking at a whole range of outcomes. That trial is ongoing. So I think for now, there's no evidence around fasting in Parkinson's, and let's wait to see the results of that trial and see what they find. So yeah, again, I would also be a little cautious around fasting because of the increased risk of weight loss, potentially malnutrition, potentially. So again, we need to be cautious around those approaches.
I've got another question. In general, the foods encouraged by Laura Mishley's most recent article fits in with the Mediterranean mind diet, and there's some advice about dairy. What are your thoughts on dairy, and should we be differentiating between milk and fermented cheese and yogurt?
Again, another good question. So dairy comes up time and time again, doesn't it, with respect to Parkinson's? And I guess there's two things just I want to for people to take away around dairy. First of all, the data around dairy and Parkinson's shows that dairy increases the risk of developing Parkinson's. So it's nothing to do with people who already have Parkinson's. And secondly, so it's the risk of developing Parkinson's. And secondly, it's only observational data. So we only have observational data. There's no trial data at all. There's been no clinical trials. There's nothing in the pipeline that I can see that actually takes people with Parkinson's and randomizes them to dairy versus no dairy to see what the outcomes are. So the chatter about dairy is only to do with the risk of developing Parkinson's. There's all sorts of other risk factors that we could talk about, but dairy often gets sort of the lens placed upon it. And secondly, I just want to caveat that with its observational data. That's where we are with dairy at the moment. So again, that relationship, it indicates association, but there's no sort of cause and effect there. And much of the data comes from the States. You know, you could, you know, there are different farming practices around the world, different use of different practices, but there's no intervention trials in people with Parkinson's to test the impact of dairy.
And there's been a few questions here about any specific advice you could give regarding protein intake and Parkinson's medication.
Yeah, so protein, when we consume foods that are rich in protein, and you've seen the slide a few times. In fact, I'm going to share it again because I think it's important just to have a look. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Perfect. So just having a look at this screen. So foods that are rich in protein are the ones that are in the blue triangle. So meat, poultry, fish, eggs, tofu, etc. Those foods. But also let's not forget that dairy foods also have protein in them. So I just want to highlight, because often we think of the meat and the chicken and the fish, and we kind of forget the dairy foods. So when we consume protein, it gets digested and it gets broken down into individual amino acids, a bit like the building blocks for dietary protein. So when we eat protein, it gets broken down to amino acids. Those amino acids actually compete with levodopa for absorption in two places, across the gastrointestinal tract and across the blood-brain barrier. So because of the competition for absorption in those two places, between the amino acids that come from the protein-containing foods and the levodopa, the recommendation is to take the two separately. So don't have your levodopa close to a meal that might contain protein, or even close to a glass of milk, because that's a protein-containing food. So the recommendation is to take your levodopa an hour before you eat. So it's essentially taken on an empty stomach. It goes into your stomach, and then it leaves the stomach and goes into the small intestine and gets absorbed. And then an hour later, then you can put some food into your stomach and have something to eat. Or to take the levodopa a couple of hours after a meal has been consumed again. So that allows time for the meal that was consumed to sort of digest from the stomach. But bear in mind, I did say that people with Parkinson's do have delayed emptying of a meal from the stomach into the small intestine. But they're the recommendations at the moment, just to have your levodopa separate from your meals that contain protein. Meals or drinks, because of course, something like milk, yogurt contain protein as well.
Okay. We have another question at the top here. I've been hearing a lot about Pro-21 diet. How is this different to the Mediterranean diet?
So the Pro-21 diet is again had been developed by Dr. Laurie Mishley in the States, and that is your person asking the question is probably talking about some paper that was published just last week. So the Pro-21 diet is so what's been done, so it's observational. So there's a group of several thousand people who are filling out dietary questionnaires and then reporting symptoms. So they're self-reporting their dietary intake and self-reporting symptoms. So those symptoms are not being objectively measured by researchers or by doctors. They're self-reporting these symptoms. These participants have been recruited online, and there is some evidence to show that different components of the diet, and this is where the question around dairy came up, may be associated with different patient reported outcomes, so patient reported symptoms. But again, just to remember that it's observational data. We don't have any intervention data at all. We don't have any trial data, randomized controlled trial data, looking to see whether the components that have been proposed in that pro diet, whether they actually have any cause and effect in people with Parkinson's. So it's quite different than the Mediterranean diet. We do have, as I mentioned, it's characterized by whole grain and fruit and veg and olive oil and oily fish and legumes and what have I forgotten? Those sorts of foods and nuts and seeds. And that does come across all the food groups that you'll see on the slide that I've in front of me, and we have some trial data. So there are differences in the approaches between the two.
Do you have any tips for people who are living with Parkinson's who are also struggling to control their blood sugars in type 2 diabetes?
I'm going to unshare that again. Gosh, that's a tricky question, and it's tricky because I have to be cautious not to give individualized dietary advice just because I don't have the whole context. So for that particular person, pop along maybe to see your GP and see would your GP be able to refer you to a dietitian. The other thing, and I should have said this, so because I did my dietetics qualification in Australia, and I'm still a member of the professional body in Australia, Dietitians Australia. So I'm still accredited in Australia, so I have access to all the useful stuff. But if you go on to the Dietitians Australia website, there's a button where it says find a dietitian. So, and I should have said this earlier, so thank you to the person who asked that brilliant question for prompting me. So go on to, and again, I can send you both this link. It allows you to find a dietitian in your area, wherever you're based across Australia. And if anyone's dialing in from overseas, there are overseas in fact, you'll see me listed on the list as being based in New Zealand. But yes, you can find a dietitian, and you can find one that's in your local area that specializes in the thing that you want to speak to them about. And that's a really useful resource, because if and some of these dietitians are private practicing dietitians. So if if there's a big waiting time, or if there isn't a dietitian as part of the service where your movement disorder specialist is, you may be able to go along and speak to a private practicing. So it's a dietitian you need rather than a nutritionist. A dietitian is the person who will be able to guide you around those kind of questions that you've asked.
Right. Well, we're almost pretty much out of time, but are there any specific handouts you'd recommend to use with clients to help get this message across?
Yes, I can forward them across to you. I drew attention at one point to the Parkinson's UK website, and they have a really nice booklet. It's a PDF, but I can send it across to you, or people can have a look there. So if you go to the Parkinson's UK website, and on the search bar on the top right, just type in diet, it'll bring you to a nice booklet, and that's a really good resource. And it's written by dietitians and nutrition scientists. It's updated regularly, and that's a good resource. The other, yeah, I was about to give another UK resources. They do resources quite well there, which are useful. There's some fact sheets that I'll be able to send you, because I mentioned things like calcium, and I mentioned nutrients like calcium and B vitamins, and often people say, what foods do I find these in? Or can you give me some examples of foods that are not dairy but contain calcium? So let me send those resources to you as well. It's probably easier. I was thinking through, do I give you it's a bit of a convoluted, I'll send those across to you and you can make those available.
Thank you. So for everyone that's listening, I'll send out an email to you at, probably tomorrow morning. They'll have a link to this webinar, but also to the documents that you've mentioned. So that'll all be there ready for you.
That's
Awesome.
fantastic.
I'll hand over back to you now, Michelle.
Wonderful. No, thank you so much, Fiona. And thank you so much for answering all those questions. I know there was a few more, so we might see if we can get some handouts on some of those questions as well. So I really appreciate it. And just to let everybody know that the next webinar is on pain by Professor Natalie Allen. So she specialises in pain and Parkinson's, and that is on the 25th of August at the same time. So look forward to seeing everyone then. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Bye.